recycling in existing sustainability rating systems. This is a College and University Recycling Coalition webinar made possible by the Alcoa Foundation with support from the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education, otherwise known as ACUPCC, and Keep America Beautiful. My name is Rob Gogan. I'm the Recycling and Waste Manager for Harvard Recycling Services, and I'll be your moderator today. This webinar is part of our free CURC Technical Webinar Series, which is designed to provide trends, information, and perspectives about recycling. We are hosting these webinars every other month on the first Thursday from 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm pleased to be joined today by two great panel members, Jeff Murphy, Manager of Go Green Services, Sightlines, LLC, and STARS Technical Advisor, and Brad Guy, Associate Director, Center for Building Stewardship, and Vice Chair, USGBC Materials and Resources, LEED Technical Advisory Group. Before we begin, I'd like to provide some housekeeping notes for today's webinar. If you have technical problems during this webinar, you can call GoToWebinar's customer support line at 800-263-6317. If you experience sound quality issues, please try hanging up and dialing back in. Because of the size of the audience, and we have almost 200 on board today, all of your lines are muted. But you can submit questions at any time using the questions panel on the right side of your screen. Any other concerns you might have can be addressed by using the chat function, which is at the bottom of your control panel. One final housekeeping note: we will be placing the slides and a recording of the webinar on the CURC website as soon as we can, so that you can review the session or share it with your colleagues. Okay, let's get started. Jeff Murphy manages Sightlines Go Green suite of services and the development and delivery of metrics, benchmarks, processes, trainings, and member presentations. He brings over 5 years of professional experience and deep knowledge of institutional sustainability initiatives to member relationships. Jeff has worked with over 50 institutions across multiple Sightlines services and has helped create more than 120 annual comprehensive greenhouse gas inventories. In addition to membership services, Jeff also leads internal professional development activities to enhance the sustainability expertise of Sightlines employees. Jeff actively promotes the development of the sustainability tools and standards across the industry. He has collaborated closely with Clean Air, Cool Planet to create a web-based campus carbon calculator and serves as a technical advisor in the Campus Waste Workgroup for STARS. Thanks for joining us, Jeff.
Thank you for having me, Rob. I'm really excited to be here, and I think we'll be able to speak to a lot of those reporting systems with some real data that we've experienced through our data collection processes. Just to give everyone a bit of background on sort of who Sightlines is and what type of work we do. We were founded about 11 years ago here in the greater New Haven area of Connecticut. We were really founded with the principle of developing a common vocabulary to speak to facilities management concerns, whether it's the stewardship of buildings or sort of operational decisions among facility staff. We're really grounded in the development of a consistent analytical methodology that we've used across about 270 institutions across the country, representing about 42 states, and most recently we went international, got our first school in Nova Scotia, and one of the really cornerstones of our analysis is providing context through benchmarking. We basically develop sets of benchmarks and compare institutional performance across multiple facets, between peer comparisons, aspirant groups, to really help schools understand both where they are, where their peers are at, and how to get from here to there in terms of performance measurement. Looking at the sort of evolution of our company, on the next slide, we're looking at our Go Green suite of services, which we introduced back in 2007, really as a response to many of our members coming to us saying, my president signed the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. You collect a lot of our data each and every year. Can you help us work through this reporting standard? From there, we've really expanded our service offerings to include strategy and tactics work, which really focuses on climate action planning and projections modeling. And most recently, in the last year and a half or so, we have engaged in the Clean Air Cool Planet partnership to help bring the existing Excel workbook into a more user-friendly and intuitive web-based interface, maintaining all the same transparency and tools and value that the Excel spreadsheet does, just making it a bit easier to utilize. In addition to that partnership, we've really tried to focus on a handful of pieces of our analysis, mainly water and waste, and expand those to really have a broader understanding of both performance and the implication of that performance across our database. And in terms of our membership work, there are really two key reporting systems that we work with our members on. The first of those is as I mentioned before, the President's Climate Commitment, currently up to about 660 signatories. They have responsibilities for reporting greenhouse gas emissions every other year to the reporting framework set up by Second Nature. And one of the reasons we've worked with Clean Air Cool Planet specifically and partnered with them in this way is that they really are the foundation of that measurement and verification from a tool standpoint to fulfill these reporting requirements. And we are the single largest user of that tool, with about 60 or so institutions in our Go Green database. In addition to the President's Climate Commitment, in more recent years, we've really seen many of our member institutions latch on to the ACUPCC STARS program because of the broad scope and broader definition of campus sustainability that it really represents, sort of getting beyond that carbon lens to look at a more holistic, institution-wide impact of campus sustainability programs. Today, what I want to do is essentially walk through how solid waste and waste management efforts and recycling efforts really fit into these two key reporting systems. First, we're going to look at the College and University President's Climate Commitment. In terms of those reporting requirements, really it's looking at the full breadth of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emission sources on campus, which you can sort of see here in this slide, and then select Scope 3 emission sources, including employee and student commuting, air travel, ground travel, and solid waste. In addition to those sort of four required Scope 3 reporting sources, they also allow for 3 additional sources to be reported, and we typically report water usage, paper, and those transmission distribution losses because of the Clean Air Cool Planet Campus Carbon Calculator having developed the methodologies and structure to calculate the emissions impact of those sources. When we are looking at the Campus Carbon Calculator itself, there are a handful of specific data requirements with regards to solid waste. Looking at that Scope 3 section, we sort of have a snippet of it here on the top right-hand side. And you can see that really the data inputs relevant here would be the municipal solid waste tonnages And then one of the snippets I didn't include is an entry line for composting. When you're entering data into these sections of the campus carbon calculator, there's a few considerations that you sort of need to have thought out beforehand or sort of have in your back pocket as you're entering the data. First is when you're entering landfill or incinerated waste, we need to be excluding construction and demolition waste. And really this is based off of the idea that the waste and materials included in construction and demolition are categorically different and therefore have different emissions factors than that of traditional municipal solid waste and the traditional waste stream coming out of college campuses. And for many of these institutions that are using landfill, really methane is the paramount concern with regards to those landfills. And we think about the construction and demolition waste from a tonnage standpoint, the majority of that weight is going to be inert materials like concrete, cement, and plasterboard. And those are going to have different emissions factors than more of those traditional waste streams that would be included in this reporting system. That sort of gets me to the next piece is really having to define the methodologies for waste disposal, looking at either incineration or landfill, and within those, from a landfill standpoint, looking at either how the methane is treated at that particular landfill, and from an incineration standpoint, what kind of incineration unit is that? Is it generating electricity from a refuse-derived fuel incinerator, or is it more of a traditional mass burn incinerator? One of the really interesting things that we're working with Clean Air Cool Plan to develop is this recycling tracking system within the campus carbon calculator. As it stands right now, the Excel-based workbook has no place to enter or track recycling tonnages because from a carbon standpoint, carbon inventory standpoint, recycling does not contribute to the carbon footprint of the institution. That being said, it's not a carbon offset, it's more of a carbon avoidance. And really what we want to be keeping our sort of eye on the prize here as we're developing this web-based portal is the importance of tracking, validating, and communicating these recycling and diversion efforts that really don't necessarily represent carbon offsets so much as carbon avoidance, so that schools and institutions can communicate the value of recycling and diversion efforts both from a cost recovery standpoint or cost avoidance standpoint, but in addition to that also from a carbon avoidance standpoint, really give these schools more tools and more lenses through which to justify and explain the recycling programs on campus. When we look at a typical institution's greenhouse gas profile, it's pretty clear that energy issues rise to the top. As I mentioned before, we work with about 55 institutions across the country to help them quantify their greenhouse gas footprint. And what we found is that typically 60 to 80% of their carbon emissions are related to energy use. And we can see there's on-campus stationary, which for those of you who may not be familiar, is sort of your traditional fossil fuel consumption. It represents typically about 35%, purchased electricity about 30%, and then T&D losses there at the top, representing between 3 and 5%. And again, this is for a typical institution. It's hard to define what typical means. Every school is different, and the different utility procurement strategies, whether you purchase district steam, whether you co-generate or not, all sort of impact this distribution of emission sources. But no matter what procurement strategy you're utilizing, we typically see a consistent amount of impact in that sort of 60 to 80% range. On the flip side, when we're looking at solid waste and wastewater, these two pieces that we really tried to develop in the last year and a half, through the carbon lens, they represent less than 1/2 of 1% at the sort of low end to upwards of 3% of the carbon emissions of the typical campus, college campus. So from a carbon lens, really waste is not a huge priority. When we look at the STARS reporting system, so sort of switching gears here, looking at the PCC reporting, from an inventory standpoint, waste isn't playing a major factor in driving the discussion of carbon emissions on campus. When we look at the STARS reporting system, there's really two sections within STARS that relate to or are impacted by solid waste management for these campuses. First, sort of mirroring what we saw on the PCC inventory side is the climate section. The greenhouse gas emissions inventory, you have a possible points of 2. This credit is really split into 2 sections. Part 1 focuses on those Scope 1 and Scope 2 sources. Part 2, which we see here, is focused on those Scope 3 sources that we outlined in the previous slides. Within this Part 2, the scoring for this section allows 1/4 of a point for each Scope 3 emission source that is being reported to STARS, or to the President's Climate Commitment. And so that means, for all intents and purposes, the impact of solid waste measurement and solid waste management on campus is 1/4 of 1 point in this section. Looking at the other credit in this section, the greenhouse gas emissions reduction, which actually has a much larger point total of 14, it was very interesting to see that Scope 3 sources actually are excluded from this credit entirely. This particular credit within the climate section is solely focused on those direct and indirect Scope 1 and Scope 2 emission sources, and having schools make progress over time on a per-weighted campus user basis. So from a climate section within STARS, we're talking about 1/4 point possible impacted by solid waste emissions on campus. The other section, which sort of justifies that limited role of solid waste in this particular category, is the waste category itself within the STARS reporting system. Here there's a few more credits, a total of 5 Tier 1 credits that cover a diversity of topics within solid waste management for college campuses. First and foremost, and I think appropriately so, is this priority on waste reduction. And we can see that prioritization both by being the first credit in the section, as well as having the largest point total possible in the section here. And this is basically giving schools credit up to those 5 points available by reducing waste generation by 50% or more since that 2005 baseline. And then obviously, it's not sort of a winner-take-all scoring system. Basically, for the percentage reduction achieved against that 2000 baseline, you apply that percentage to the points total. So if you get a 25% reduction, that would be roughly half that of the maximum reduction we're looking for. So we'd get half the points associated with that credit. Sort of to reflect on the importance of diversion strategies, we have these next 2 credits, which really focus on sort of that municipal solid waste diversion effort, which sort of recognizes institutions who are diverting waste and material resources through composting, recycling, donation, reuse, and sort of the multitude of other diversion strategies being implemented across the country. And this has a total of 3 points available. From this perspective, a scoring standpoint, really it's pretty simple. You take your diversion rate, whether it's 10%, 20%, 30%, multiply that by the possible points available, in this case 3, and that is how many credits or how many points you're awarded for this particular credit. So you can do the math there pretty easily, but again, these are overall pretty small point totals possible for these programs that really are substantial in time, effort, and engagement, which we'll be talking about a little bit later in the presentation. For OP Credit 19, it's sort of the same methodology that we saw previously. This is just really focused on that construction and demolition waste, where you look at for your construction and demolition projects that have occurred within the reporting time frame for STARS, you take the diversion rate of that C&D waste, multiply it by 1 to determine the points that you'll be awarded for this particular credit. So it was really interesting as we sort of moved through these waste credits. There's this split here. The first 3 really are performance-driven credits. You have to be showing, quantifying progress in reducing total waste stream generation, increasing your diversion rate for both municipal solid waste as well as construction and demolition waste on your campus. We're now sort of switching gears and getting more into a program and policy-driven credit section where there's sort of yes-no questions. The first here is the electronics recycling program. This is basically split into 2 sections, a half point for institutional electronics and a half point for student electronics. Basically, sort of looking at the 2 streams of electronic waste and making sure that recycling programs on campus are equipped and publicized to handle both of those streams of electronic waste. The OP Credit 21 is sort of a bare minimum credit where you have to have a hazardous waste disposal program, and actually as we go into STARS 2.0, there's talk about removing this particular credit because it is such a low bar, a low threshold to meet as just having this program, because for most institutions this is mandated by either the state or municipal government, so it's sort of redundant to give someone credit for something they're just simply mandated to have anyway. And really, it was, I think, one of the easiest credits looking at how STARS analyzed the credits and who got the most credits, most points for specific credits. I think all but a handful of schools got the full points associated with the hazardous waste program points. In addition to these sort of Tier 1 credits, we also have a handful of Tier 2 credits, and those are, again, sort of these yes-no questions. It's focusing on having materials exchanges, again, sort of speaking to that reuse and donation program, limited printing, having course and catalog materials online to avoid additional printing, having move-in, move-out programs. All of these different types of sort of programmatic and policy-driven Tier 2 credits add up to a possible 1.5 points. So in all, we're sort of seeing a total within the waste section, a total of about 12.5 points available if you scored at the top of all of these. So basically, those last several slides come sort of to this bottom line here, where for the climate, we're talking 1/4 of 1 point. For the waste section, if you've achieved a 50% reduction since 2005 baseline, if you divert 100% of your waste, both construction and demolition, as well as sort of the traditional waste stream, and you have these sort of policy and programmatic credits as well, you're going to get a total of about 11 or 12 points out of all of that work, out of a total of 300 points within STARS, all the different sections of STARS. So we're talking roughly 3 to 3.5% of credits and points available within STARS is related to solid waste and waste management efforts on campus. Ironically, that's interesting to to me because we saw that sort of 3% number back a few slides earlier with regards to the role that waste plays in a campus carbon inventory. So just because the sort of two main reporting systems that we work with don't prioritize waste management doesn't mean that it's not important. And I think that's really one of the points I wanted to drive home here on this webinar. Just because from a credit standpoint and a reporting standpoint, solid waste doesn't play a huge role doesn't mean that there isn't value to be gained out of these programs. You know, looking at sort of waste management programs with the 60 or so schools that I've worked with for Go Green Services, you know, one of the recurring themes I see as I talk to students, sustainability coordinators, waste management folks on campus, you know, the single most visible component of any campus's sustainability program is that waste diversion program. You know, when a student or a faculty member walks into a classroom and sees a recycling bin, or when a community member that isn't even associated with the institution walks into the dining hall and sees a compost bin to divert food waste, that is a very clear, visible indication that the university or the institution has prioritized environmental and sustainability issues in their day-to-day operations. And the bottom line is, you know, do we want our campuses to look like the icon on the left, or do we want to have a more diversified strategy that diverts reusable and recyclable materials and really limits the amount of waste we're sending to landfills or incinerators? The other reason I really am fascinated by solid waste management and waste streams on campus is that unlike really any other source emission source that I work with with college campuses, this is an institutional intersection. We see so many different components of the institution coming into play when we look at metrics regarding solid waste. You know, it's important from a policy standpoint to make sure you're purchasing the right types of materials that can be recycled and reused and are durable items. From a policy standpoint, you need to actually institute a recycling or composting or other diversion program itself. But in addition to those policy components, we really need to have this infrastructure and engagement piece as well. So having the bins, having the signage from an infrastructure standpoint, these recycling and diversion programs. But the bottom line is that it comes down to engagement. You know, it's a personal decision as to whether I take this piece of paper, throw it in a garbage can, or I decide to put it in a recycling bin or a composting bin, as the case may be. So as much as the institution wants to control these sorts of programs, really the engagement piece in many ways is the most important aspect of waste management. And when we talk about energy issues on campus, boiler replacements, chiller upgrades, insulation, those sorts of things aren't tangible or participatory in the same way that solid waste management programs are. You can hold a piece of trash in your hand, know what it is, understand the global and campus level implications of that material. That's not something you can do with an MMBTU of natural gas or a kilowatt hour of electricity. There's something different about waste management programs that really engages the campus community and sort of can rally the troops for both diversion efforts as well as larger, broader campus sustainability programs. When we sort of started this conversation introducing what we do, I sort of said we're a benchmarking firm, we're a data and knowledge company, and up to this point I've sort of restrained myself. I haven't actually shown a graph yet, but sort of this is where that streak ends, and I get into my data and my geekiness here. But what we really want to see here is sort of that those two themes that were outlined really well within waste section of STARS. Waste reduction in terms of the total waste stream being generated either at a gross number or normalized per student. And then we want to be looking at those diversion rates, which we see on the right-hand side of that graph. And what we've found is that, that policy piece, the purchasing, sort of how much material throughput is coming onto campus really drives the metric on the left in terms of how much total waste is being generated on campus. And in terms of our database performance, we really sort of see two echelons. Schools that are producing in that sort of 350 to 500 pounds of total waste per student, and then those schools that are producing in the 600 to 800 pounds per student range. And there's sort of a real split there within our database. We see a few institutions that are both above that and below that, and that's sort of some unique situations on that particular campus. Some of those really have set the target of being a zero waste institution and have put that sort of at the top of their sustainability priority list. And for school HH, that's the case. And we really see that prioritization being manifested in the metrics that we are using to evaluate. From a diversion strategy, let me go back to the last slide. The last graph I want to leave you with here is this diversion benchmark that we use to look at the compost and recycling programs and what % of waste is that diverting. And our database average for recycling is right about 20 to 25% diversion rate for recycling alone. And then when we look at composting and recycling together, we get up into that sort of 40 to 50% range. In terms of our top performers, we really have these sort of two or three schools that sort of stick out above and beyond the rest of our database, and they're diverting close to 75% of their total waste materials. And this is for 2011 data. We're in the process of updating our database for fiscal year 12, and one of the things that we updated this year was we included an other diversions category. So we sort of going to have a fourth bar here on the right-hand graph to look at the variety of other diversion strategies that institutions have implemented, whether that be that electronics recycling or reclaiming tires and mattresses, whatever the case may be. We want to make sure that we're helping schools quantify those components of their diversion strategy, not just sort of the bare bones traditional cans, bottles, plastics, aluminum, and more recently the composting programs that we're seeing on campuses. The last slide I'll leave you with is really sort of how I frame campus sustainability initiatives. It really is a balancing act between those impactful but invisible projects that really tackle those 60 to 80% of campus emissions that are really focused around energy management and looking at both the space management of campus, not building new space unless you absolutely need to, looking at the energy efficiency, taking those opportunities to replace boilers and chillers and do roof and insulation projects that, like I was saying before, no one can really feel, touch, or see, but make a very tangible impact on the carbon footprint and operational sustainability of the institution. On the other side, we really need to focus on those visible and ultimately visceral type projects that engage and excite the campus community to really both change personal behaviors as well as have those be sort of the first stepping stone into playing a larger role within the campus sustainability program. And when I was a student, I was really focused on recycling programs on my campus, and it was really the stepping stone into the goal of achieving climate neutrality for my institution over the 5 years I was there. And so through that participation and through that programming, we can really, increase our street credit and parlay that into larger impacts in multiple areas across the institution when it comes to campus sustainability programs. And I think, as you guys can tell, I love talking about this stuff. So if any of you have any questions or comments or would like to talk more about sort of the data behind our benchmark, please feel free to give me a call, and my contact information is there, and certainly Rob can always forward you my contact information if you don't get it here today.
Thank you, Jeff, very much. That was fascinating, and I appreciate you keeping your graphs to just a couple of very good and data-rich graphs in your PowerPoint. There have been several questions that have been coming in, a lot from the West Coast. So I guess everyone here on the East Coast is dealing with the nor'easter we have today. But we got a question from Karen Kaplan at the University of Oregon with respect to the well, there's some confusion on the idea of talking about greenhouse gas versus CO2. Are we talking about, the methane that comes out of landfilled organic materials that we fail to capture for recycling or composting? Or are we talking about the upstream greenhouse gas generated in the production of the materials?
Right.
Say a little more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to the President's climate commitment, and then more specifically the campus carbon calculator that Clean Air Cool Planet has developed, which I'd certainly recommend you guys looking into. The numbers that we're looking at there really doesn't take into account the upstream production emissions. And when I say GHGs or greenhouse gases, I'm talking about sort of the full complement of the 21 gases. I may have said carbon, just sort of a shorthand. We're talking about carbon dioxide equivalent, so that we do take into account the methane, nitrogen oxide, as well as the carbon dioxide, but can talk about it distinctly using one unit and sort of one value there. Really, from a carbon standpoint, waste management and the solid waste numbers that are being generated and asked for within the President's climate commitment is really just focusing on the downstream methane being released from landfills or the combination of carbon dioxide and other gases that are released from incinerators. In the case of refuse-derived fuel incinerators, there's actually, surprisingly enough, a carbon offset associated with waste being sent there, which sort of makes our job a little bit more challenging when we say, you actually have a negative carbon footprint for your solid waste because it's going to a refuse-derived fuel incinerator and avoiding the use of fossil fuels to generate electricity. And we've had certain schools sort of tongue-in-cheek say, well, why isn't our climate action plan just to throw everything in the garbage then? And that's sort of when we need to take a step back and say, we need to be thinking sort of beyond the carbon lens and more broadly at the sort of campus and operational sustainability perspective. But we're not too focused just on the numbers, because solid waste doesn't really impact your greenhouse gas inventory too substantially. We need to be thinking about that larger impact that these diversion programs have on that engagement piece, on that visibility piece, in addition to the inventory.
Thanks, Jeff. That's helpful. Joel Ostroff has a question. If a school is employing composting of organic waste generated at the school, how does that figure into the calculations? I know you mentioned it briefly. Does it provide carbon offset or just avoidance?
It does actually provide a small carbon offset, and I don't remember the exact emissions factor off the top of my head. I think it's think it's like 0.15 tons of CO2 equivalent for every ton of waste, but I'd have to look that up. I don't have that that good of a, I may be a numbers guy, but I don't have that detail of a numbers memory. But it does provide a small carbon offset for your campus, and that's reflected through the campus carbon calculator in the additional offset category.
We have time for a couple more questions here. One of them from Lynn King at UC Berkeley comes in. How can we raise the priority of waste diversion and recycling in STARS? It's very important, near and dear to all our hearts. It's a very visible campus commitment to sustainability, very democratic in that it requires everyone's help, from the custodian to the college president. Do you have any ideas as to how we can raise the profile a little bit of waste reduction and recycling?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially in the great timing, very responsive. Right now, STARS is under the STARS 2.0 public comment period, and they're actually looking for your responses and your perspectives on the STARS rating system, so that they can really help define the weighting of credits. So should it be 5 points? Should it be 10 points? Should it be 25 points? What types of credits were most relevant to you? There's been a lot of talk about the baseline issues. Using that 2005 baseline, sort of almost penalizing early adopters of waste reduction strategies. So I think that the first stop is to talk with, submit comments to the public comment period. One of the things that I try to do as a technical advisor on the waste group is to really bring up those exact same points about the visibility and sort of, Robert, you and I were talking about before, sort of how students and faculty that see a successful and well-managed recycling program can really use that credibility to parlay into those larger energy efficiency and offset conversations because of that sort of foundational credibility of waste management programs. Really opens up a whole plethora of opportunities to engage the campus community. So, I'm trying, and I think if you guys could support me by making your comments heard through the public comment period on the ACUPCC STARS website, I think that's probably the best strategy there.
Okay, and so we can find the place to comment at the ACUPCC website?
Yes, if you go to the ACUPCC website and then you can click on STARS banner right up at the top of the website. I believe it's right on their homepage, is sort of the STARS 2.0 public comment period. And if I remember correctly, that comment period ends November 30th. So we have a little bit of time, but with Thanksgiving in there, it's important to do it sooner rather than later, or else it's just going to fall off your radar. And if any of you are on the sort of Green Schools listserv through Brown, they've been posting links on there to try and increase the number of comments they're receiving. And from talking with the folks at the steering committee level and sort of Chris Pelton, who's sort of the facilitator of all the different technical advisor working groups, he's a really great guy, and he's absolutely committed to reading every single comment that comes through. And he's done a great job of diligently working through the perspectives and complaints and frustrations that he's getting from all sides.
Uh-huh. Great. Well, we've kind of kicked over a hornet's nest with this line of questioning. There's lots of questions coming in, far more than we can answer right now. But if we have time at the end, we'll take them up. But now it's time to turn to Bradley Guy. Excuse me, Brad, an assistant, and thank you very much, Jeff, for a fabulous presentation. You've done a good job of making a dry but extremely important topic Very interesting. Bradley Guy is an assistant professor in the School of Architecture and Planning at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Brad is a member of the U.S. GBC Materials and Resources TAG and a technical resource expert for the Clinton Climate Initiative Climate Positive program. Recent projects include a study on end-of-life management of building plastics and assisting in materials reuse for a proposed LEED Platinum Community Center in New Orleans. He has also developed a certification for verifying the recycling rates of mixed CD debris recycling facilities on behalf of the Construction Materials Recycling Association. Brad teaches a course at the Yestermorrow Design Build School on Design for Deconstruction and Reconstruction and wrote the Design for Disassembly in the Built Environment Guide for King County, Washington. He was also a contributor to the California High Performance Schools Green Building Rating System. Brad is an associate of the AIA and a USGBC LEED AP. Brad's teaching and research focus on building deconstruction, design for adaptability and deconstruction, design, use reused and recycled materials, and life cycle analysis of materials reuse and recycling. Take it away, Brad.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here today, Rob and Cirque. So I'd first like to go over just a brief outline of what I'll talk about. The focus is on the LEED Green Building Rating System today, and also then to discuss the distinctions for campus and group projects, which do overlap and facilitate some of the recycling-oriented credits, and then also to talk about LEED version 4, which is the next version that's been taking quite a while to develop and is also in a public comment period, and we hope to be released next summer 2013. So just to describe how LEED deals with waste management and credits, if you could back up. If you could go to previous, thanks. So generally, as you may know, LEED is divided into policies and within prerequisites, and then also the credits, the performance aspects from which points are derived. It's also important to note that in all the waste management credits in LEED, the metric of either waste or volume can be used as long as they are consistent across all the credits for that particular project. LEED is a very dynamic system, and we do try to revise it on a 3-year cycle to keep up with trends and to raise the bar and to maintain the leadership status that LEED is really fundamentally about. So within these policy or credit attributes, we have two forms of a building type generally, the EBOM, which is existing building operation and maintenance, and then new construction. And just to reference also the weight of materials and resources as a category within the LEED system, up to 14 points can be achieved through all the materials and resources credits out of 92 credits or points in EBOM and 110 points in new construction. So it's worth about, the materials generally are worth about 15% of all the credits possible in EBOM and about 13% of all the credits in new construction. I would also like to note that LEED version 4 is in the 5th public comment. It is open for public comments about all the credits, and that is, the deadline there is December 10th, and the ballot that we hope to have is for June 1st, 2013, after which there will be a 3-year period that LEED 2009 will remain open for projects to apply to until completely switching over to LEED version 4. So if we can go to the next slide. So a unique aspect that attempt to streamline and economize and really take advantage of different economies of scales is that the LEED system does have distinctions between projects that exist alone and then also campus projects or group projects. So for example, for universities, and this can also be a corporate campus or other types of institutions such as a governmental agency, they would then apply under a master site certification. So the first step in this is to create a master site, which is based upon a single location, and it could be a very broad or large location, but it does have a boundary, and within that boundary then certain credits are in effect sort of grandfathered in through the application of the master site. Subsequently then all projects that go through the LEED building certification can use these campus credits, the credits that are eligible under the campus certification, over and over again. They don't have to reapply, they don't have to recreate that documentation and so on. The difference between a campus project or campus certification and a group project type certification is that the campus is a single large group of buildings, and any number of projects at any given time can take place and still meet that requirement. For a group certification, this requires that that group of buildings or individual projects must all be under the same contract and take place about the same time frame, so that there's a consistency there and a limit on the time and the contractual relationships for those projects. So in the next, so I'm just going to go through the different credits here. In EBOM, the existing buildings operation and maintenance, and again also for new construction, prerequisites require a solid waste management policy. And this policy, just to be really clear, is not a performance basis. It's a narrative, a document, a description of intent. There are no reportable requirements for this prerequisite, and that's the sort of quid pro quo of a requirement. It does not provide or create a barrier to entry into the LEED system if, in fact, infrastructure, for example, for recycling is not present. The project, the campus can still make this application overall for a LEED certification. And there's three main waste streams that we're concerned with in EBOM: ongoing consumables, durable goods, and then alterations and additions, which would be then physical built environment waste or debris, which may, of course, be very different than for large-scale new construction. It may be the case, it certainly is for Catholic, that the university as a whole manages all the waste and utilities, so any single building's ability to recycle is dictated by the campus's administrative policy. So for us, we have to have a campus-wide policy in order to affect a single building. And this policy can be used either for a group of buildings if, for example, a department or a school has its own facilities and can operate in that manner, or if, in fact, the campus is under one single administration, the policies and facilities that take place. So we then look at, within that policy, in the next slide, specifically for facilities alterations and additions. This requires then, for example, the contractual relationships with haulers are defined, the material stream is targeted, even though, again, this may be for different building projects that may take even in the future, take place in the future. We generally know a lot of similar construction material types such as concrete, brick, lumber, masonry, and so on. A unique aspect for this, which is not maybe so specific to the material stream, is also a construction indoor air quality plan. And so that in this policy, there is a plan and a process for protecting the interior environments of any project or building while a renovation or alteration is taking place. And so then this applies to a campus or a group of buildings that may take place for projects in the future. And then in the next, in terms of credits, so for solid waste management, there are 4 credit or points available within the system. A waste stream audit specifically for ongoing consumables, diversion of ongoing consumables, durable goods, facilities and alterations, waste. So what is a waste stream audit comprised of? It's looking only at ongoing consumables. As many of you know and was just discussed, the most important aspect of any metric is establishing a baseline. And within that baseline, to know the types of waste and the amount of each waste type by weight or volume, and have a consistent process for converting, for example, from weight to volume or vice versa, depending upon the metric that you choose to use. And then identifying the opportunities for diversion. You can note that for this audit, it must take place for each project individually in order to get this point. The reason might be obvious. Certainly different types of buildings within a campus can be radically different in their ongoing consumables waste production. So for example, a campus union and a dining hall versus a dormitory or laboratory. So we do want to go to the fine grain of single project or building types. And so then what are, for example, ongoing consumables? And in the next, then we show, and this is what you might expect. So food waste clearly would be a different and major component of the dining hall facility or project building versus a building such as a dormitory or other buildings. But you can then, in the operation of this credit, consolidate between buildings. So if we collect, for example, paper waste amongst a single set of buildings, campus buildings, classroom buildings, they can be grouped together if there's some economies of scale available to the campus in having a single point of collection and processing for that material. So durable goods then is, as you might expect, it's longer lasting office equipment, appliances, electronics, and so on, and a pretty high bar for diversion, 75% rate of diversion for durable goods for the point that's available. And then in alterations and additions, the bar there is 70% diversion, which is pretty high for those who work in that arena. And it is higher than in the new construction waste management point threshold, which is 50%. And we do that because in renovation, you inherently have better opportunities for source separation. Depending upon the project, you may have a limited set of materials and the scope of the renovation or alteration. If it's just, for example, a roof replacement, you have a very limited set of materials and a much easier process just in terms of how that work takes place to be able to separate that material. If you are able to separate, then we know that there's better chances, a cleaner material stream typically has a better opportunity for recycling. And this can also then be used in a group application if a series of alterations are taking place under a similar contract. So now I'm going to move on to the new construction and major renovation credits that are available in LEED. In the current version, 2009, the prerequisite we have is storage and collection of recyclables. As if you've worked on a project that's gotten the LEED certification, this is not a performance credit. It is then to show a dedicated space for recycling physically on the building or site plan, and to target these 5 main waste streams within that plan. So to provide a collection of paper, corrugated cardboard, glass, plastic, and metals. So it's pretty prescriptive in that way. It really just targets what are generally understood to be large flows of typical waste in these operations. A distinction for this credit in terms of campuses is if, for example, on a single building, you may certainly have bins that are collecting at that point, but if the campus and the vendor have figured out some sort of central collection or consolidation, you can use that consolidation and have, for example, the waste go outside of the boundary of that single project to other sites on the campus, as long as they're on the campus. And this project can still use the campus certification process. In terms of the credit in a new construction or a major renovation, which is in the next slide, we have 50% or 75% total diversion of all waste. And so this is the performance aspects of the new construction process. And again, for campuses, even though you may be building a project one at a time, for example, if you have an ongoing sort of construction that might be a complex of buildings that are physically separated, the campus process can take place. There is a stipulation that, and this is sort of for our sake, that we know that under the same contract, for example, the general contractor, they're going to typically then use the same vendors for waste and recycling and avail themselves of that economy of scale. But in terms of documentation, there is a consistency of using the same landfills or recycling facilities, reporting similarly, and also then in terms of time frame that there's not a great lag between the completion of projects, which would obviously delay the first project certification until other projects have also completed their work. But one can avail themselves of that campus certification. And just to note then, this next slide, just to point out, there are, I'm sure everyone on this call is aware, standard metrics for conversions in LEED allowing for weight or volume as the metric. So in terms of reporting, there is no hard and fast rule. There are certainly guides, and in the documentation for LEED, there's guidance for conversion factors, but the individual projects, as long as they provide reasonable conversion factors, can use those factors to help them with their documentation. And so then I'll just sort of highlight here that in the next slide that all of the LEED documentation is online at this time, and there is a constant process of upgrading and facilitating the ease of this online submittal process. It's very different than it was when we got going about 12 years ago, and it's a continuous process, and it receives a lot of feedback, of course, because the documentation is very extensive on how and what might be done to make it more effective. So this is just a shot for the storage and collection of recyclables prerequisite, showing how more or less a quick and enter system, any of the documentation can be uploaded through the LEED Online system. And so this means that all of the submittals are done electronically. There is then typically a template, a letter template that a project architect, and in some cases the contractors, also then fill out to verify using their letterhead that their submittals are honestly given. It's the best word I can use. But then the accountability is through just uploading then receipts and documentation of the process that's taken place. And so then in the next slide to show for construction waste management credits, again, it's a relatively simple process, at least able to use the online system. So in that case, row by row, illustrating the different waste streams, which is then a very simple calculation that's done within the program. and then uploading all their documentation. So the receipts, for example, for haulers, and any other documentation that's used. So I'm now going to move on to LEED version 4. So this is the exciting and has actually caused a fair amount of, say, widespread comment. Hopefully, if you're interested in commenting, please do so. And what LEED version 4 is really in this materials and category section is raised the bar quite a bit on targeting certain materials that have not been well recycled or have developed the recycling infrastructure, which LEED has been shown to be very good at doing. So we hope to use the market power of LEED to really diversify the material streams that become more recyclable and recycled, and then also to really also, I won't say close the gaps, but increase the verification process, the certification process, and the operational reporting. So LEED originated as as-built or a modeled new building system. It evolved into using EBOM and allowing for buildings that have already been built. And we're now moving much more towards that operational performance, not only in energy, for example, like Energy Star, requiring 1 year of operation, but also in these other operational attributes, that performance over time is also living up to the modeling or the original condition. So in EBOM, there's a little bit of language change. The ongoing waste policy is a consolidation of that term. And so now we're looking at minimum, that the waste policy targets the 5 most purchased products and then the full list of all the same durable and ongoing consumables that were in LEED version 2009. So either way, that at least the top 5 purchased products are targeted, and then that all of the main materials types that we know would typically take place in these categories of durable and consumables are also targeted in that policy. And then in the facilities, now slightly new term, but facilities maintenance and renovation credit, the prerequisite there, so it's just a slight name change from alterations and additions. You'll note that we are targeting at least 5 materials for diversion. So part of this is no longer to allow the achievement of the credit, for example, by weight. If you then move on to the credit achievement, which can happen if you have, for example, concrete is a very heavy material and the credits can be used in some cases in large part through one material stream. And this is not to diminish the importance of recycling any material, concrete or steel, for example, which have pretty good infrastructure, but to just move the bar further along. So when we think of things like carpet, drywall, packaging, plastics, how can we help facilitate that diversity? And it may align in some cases with life cycle impacts and CO2 impacts when you think of paper and plastic, for example. In the EBOM credit application, everything is more or less the same, except you can note that you're adding mercury-containing lamps to the consumables category. And as I noted, it's no longer sufficient to make a one-time application or certification. The project must be willing to submit to an audit every 5 years. So there is this continuous process where the project, the campus will perform audits and be able to track and increase, or maybe the better you get, things get much easier, we hope. In new construction and renovation, the storage and collection of recyclables stays the same. But the major revision that we have now is that in order to meet this prerequisite, we go for the top 4 waste streams of new construction activities. And you can see that we add specifically, prescriptively, some of the emerging and hazardous waste streams that we felt strongly needed to be targeted. And so you'll see collection, storage, and disposal of at least 2 of the following, which is batteries, mercury-containing lamps, or electronic waste. Certainly the emergence of e-waste is something that we should be more attentive to, and we try to do that in this revision for LEED 2004, version 4. And then in the prerequisite, we have a new prerequisite for construction and demolition waste management, which is a plan. So this, previously LEED awarded credits in new construction for achieving a construction waste management diversion. And we had a lot of debate about actually creating a minimum diversion rate, but what we felt was equally important, if all projects required to create a construction waste management plan, even if they don't attempt the credit, as many of you know, the process of formalizing, planning, auditing, identifying potential services or haulers, for example, for this process, you might actually find opportunities that did not exist before. And whatever the achievement rate is, this prerequisite then requires a final report of whatever process was taking place. So you are then at least going through the formalized process that would either facilitate the achievement of the credits, or perhaps in the future, in future projects, and the interest in developing those becomes greater. Another major change for LEED version 4 is that alternative daily cover, called ADC, will no longer count as diversion for new construction and renovation. In terms of the credits now, we have two different paths that we did not have before. So the diversion path, which was the sum of all opportunities in version 2009, is still there, 50% diversion or 75% diversion. But on top of that, the 50% must be achieved through at least 3 material streams, and the 75% achievement must be achieved in at least 4 material streams. And no longer will ADC, or alternative daily cover, count as a diversion material. More radically new option for achievement of these credits is the reduction of total waste from a project. So we've set a baseline of 2.5 pounds per square foot of waste generation from a new construction or major renovation as an achievement of a very high rate of waste reduction. So a project can achieve all the credit or points for this credit just by reducing their total waste altogether. And so what are the material streams when we say material streams and targeting 3 or 4 of them? And this list just shows you the examples in the construction context, the types of materials. So we're trying to call out it's a relatively fine-grained list of materials. You'll see that commingled materials together is one waste stream. So in the past, for example, if you were able to, or had to, in many cases it may be difficult to have source separation or separate recycling processes, the credit could be entirely achieved through a single stream of materials. We are asking now that this be divided. And there is a way to overcome if one has to use a single stream process. If the facility taking that material then can report on separate material recycling, so that they do some form of separation and can report not just a single number of the diversion from their facility, but can report X percentage or amount on a facility basis, for example, of different materials types. So that's shown a little bit in the next slide. The options, if you have just defined by the project or the facility reporting to a government authority, or the facility just reporting on its own by individual material streams to meet that necessity for distinct material streams. We are also then looking at third-party certifications and there's certainly a market in developing these third-party certifications. And so exemplary credit to be awarded for an additional verification of the certification by the facility. I'd like to just briefly mention something that USGBC does through its student groups process, and which is through the Center for Green Schools of the U.S. Green Building Council. And USGBC student groups are student organizations that carry out different projects, environmentally responsible and service-oriented. And so one of the projects that the Center for Green Schools is promoting and rewarding and helping recognize student groups for doing is called the Don't Be Trashy program, which is a freshman move-in, move-out every September, and encouraging student groups. If you have student groups on your campus, if they're not already aware of this program, or you're interested in the Center for Green Schools, and it's very much targeting the importance of education in schools as conduits, let us say, of environmental awareness and knowledge, and the energy and enthusiasm that we can have through young people to help in the next generation. And if you'll forego me one last slide, I'd like to just promote an event that we're hosting here at Catholic University next spring called the Reclaim and Remake Symposium. And we are looking for abstracts, and this is a focused symposium on design, education, and research for the current and future reuse and recycling of material resources in the built environment. We're making it broad, that this can be land, buildings, materials, the whole idea of just acknowledging wasted or unutilized, underappreciated assets in the realm of the built environment. We really want to encourage obviously educators, but researchers, and also advanced university students where we can present their posters of their projects and work and create a forum for discussion. It will be during the Cherry Blossom Festival next year, so we hope it's a nice time for people in Washington, and there's the website down below. So if you know of anybody interested in submitting an abstract, we'd love to hear from you. And I thank you very much for your time. And I think we move on then with Rob and everything else.
Thanks very much, Brad. I really appreciate that talk and all the good information you were able to convey to us. We did have a few questions that came in, and we do have time for a couple of questions. One of them, for LEED existing buildings, EBOM, you mentioned that every building has to do an audit or be open to an audit every 5 years. Who does the waste audits, and are there standard protocols for their execution, and is there a database somewhere where we can see maybe results from waste audits from different types of campus buildings?
So the audit process is undertaken by the campus itself. LEED does operate on in effect an honor system. It does utilize letterheads and signatures of the reporting agencies, whether it's an architect or a campus owner, to verify those, for, in this case, audits. I'm not aware of a database for the audits themselves. In LEED version 4, we are just creating the guidance documents for these new credits and the variations of these credits. So over the next 6 months after public comment ends and before the public ballot in June, all the guidance document language will be created for example, these credits. And in the EBOM credit, this is a new requirement that this audit will have to take place every 5 years. So that documentation will be created, and certainly also in line with the current online submittal process, it will be all streamlined and automated to allow submittal electronically.
Okay. Thanks. And another question from Lynn King. Will lead for, I noticed there was an option there for commingling material, C&D waste streams. Will lead for prioritize source separation on site versus commingling and having the C&D waste sorted off-site. Is there any priority to that? You know, Brett?
It's not a priority. Just the implementation of the 3 or 4 waste streams. It doesn't prioritize which waste stream. It does just suggest that commingling alone is literally not sufficient. So we can't say that you get, if you use no commingling process and you just had all source separation, for example, that would still be equal to commingling plus some lesser amount of site separation. But we're certainly not then allowing commingled, commingled processing only. So that's a kind of inverse prioritization, I guess you could say.
Uh-huh. Okay, and a question from Shannon LeBlanc. For materials recycling credit C&D waste option 2, by how much does waste have to be reduced in order to get the credit?
So this is certainly something to submit to the public comment. We went through quite a literature search and database search to try to develop what is the average C&D waste production from different projects. Of course, there can be different production. So, for example, EPA puts out a figure of about 4.5 pounds per square foot. So that is what one is reducing from. This average literature-based, what is the typical project? The number itself for achieving the credit is an absolute number. It's 2.5 pounds per square foot. So if you had not produced 2.5 pounds to begin with, then I guess you could say there is no reduction. You already have a very efficient project. And this is what can happen. You're trying to apply this to a very large scope, nationally, internationally, and different building types. So there is no reduction from. There is just an absolute number. If you do not produce more than 2.5 pounds per square foot for your project.
Great. And we do have time for another question or two if someone wants to type it in. But in the meantime, I would like to thank our panel members today, Larry and Jeff, as well as the Alcoa Foundation, sponsor of the Kirk webinar series, and series partners ACI and Keep America Beautiful, especially Larry Kaufman, who's working diligently behind the scenes to make sure that everything works properly, and any technical aspects of the presentation, as well as posting the audio and PowerPoint presentation on the Kirk website. Thank you, Larry. And Anja Nicolaitis, who all year long, throughout this whole webinar series, has worked very hard in putting together speaker lists, calling potential speakers, setting up conference calls, what should we talk about in this, et cetera, and et cetera, et cetera. I really want to express my profound thanks to Anja. And we will be putting together a webinar series for 2013 in the coming month or so. We're aiming for a January webinar, and we've got a couple of good topics that we're working on getting speakers for. And we're delighted that Alcoa has seen fit to renew this program. So once again, Bradley and Jeffrey, I want to thank you sincerely, and We look forward to seeing you all in the Kirk Webinar Series 2013. So thanks again.